As I was listening to both Davy and Clem, I was thinking of what do we do with all this? When I'm teaching at Gibbs, I often say about leadership, the work you're all doing, is we need two tools. The one is a map, which both of you have really kind of given us a bit of a sense. What I always say is how you and I have got in the room and what we're doing in the room is not how we're going to get out of the room. And so this fantastic terrain that you've painted is full of opportunity, full of challenges, but it's really, it's this, how do we draw the map? How do we empower ourselves in our roles to make a map? There are three kinds of people. There are those who go through life not knowing about the map. There are those who read the maps, and then those who make the maps. And South Africa, at this juncture, needs map makers. And that's why I'm driven, manically driven by this 18-month period in which the window has opened again. And I'm glad we've got this view out here because we're a country with a view. And what I've learned is you just need to give someone a room with a view. In 1976, on the 16th of June, I happened to be working for Mobil Oil in New York in their political affairs department. And that was a day that changed my life because I wasn't here to live through it. I experienced this tragedy at a distance, had much more impact on me. But around about that time, my boss, we were on the 40th floor, just near Grand Central, took me to the window and he put his arm around me and he said, "Nick, this is Rome." And I hadn't quite understood that Manhattan was what it was, and I've never forgotten it. All we need to do is give ourselves and the people we work with a room with a view. So maybe we should turn all the chairs and look out there and look north to the billion people north of us. I want to come back to that because we haven't talked about Africa and its potential. We just need a room with a view. What I say leaders need is a map and a mirror. The map is the journey, how you got into the room, what you're doing, what you're going to do. And the mirror is why are you here? And as we went through the difficulties of the last 5 years, I think the question of why, in a way, became as important, if not more important, than how. South Africans are very pragmatic. We're doers. But the why we are in the room, I think, is hugely important. We are blessed with amazing institutions. I look at Sandton City and how we've doubled its height in the last 5 years. And the blinding, obvious conclusion is that Sandton is the center of the center of the center of the African economy. If you just go with these numbers, Gauteng is 3% of our land mass, 35% of our GDP, and Gauteng is 10% of Africa's GDP. So the inheritance of our generation is the remarkable institutions that are there. But I want to share with you, before I start the conversation, an experience I had with a Harvard professor who was sent out to Africa to find out where to put Harvard's Africa office. They've been working at this for 10 years, believe it or not, so I don't know how Harvard make decisions, but he'd been to Addis and Nairobi, actually at Dubai. They thought of Dubai as a venue, but Addis, Nairobi, and then Cape Town, where I come from, the mountain place. And he wasn't going to come to Joburg, but there was a blizzard in Boston and he got delayed for 24 hours. And so someone phoned me and said, would I take him around? And I drove him straight into Sandton at 5 o'clock. And he turned, and there's a guy, he's 54, speaks 9 languages, a Chinese expert, unbelievable guy. He says to me, my God, this is Los Angeles. Because he'd been to Nairobi and Addis and there's nothing like what he was seeing. And then we crossed the bridge into Alex. And I walked him through Alex into the shacks. And he said something that will just stay with me. I want to share it with you. As we then started heading up to ORT, he said to me, he was very thoughtful, he said, who's the idiot who built a freeway between Alex and Sandton? For people of Sandton, and you talked about the Hyde Park Shopping Center, this is probably the center of Cape Town is closer to Sandton than Alex. And for many of us, London may be closer to Joburg than Alex. And so this wonderful thing that you've ended with this lovely story of the rocket fuel, I think we've got to buy the story. So what I want to ask you to do before we get into the questions is, so how do you conceptualize your role? How do you think about the opportunity, the size of the opportunity we've got? And what might you change about your habits? Being at a business school, of course, we teach. What I've often noticed about teaching is it's the notes of the professor becoming the notes of the student without going to the brains of either. At least that was my undergrad experience. So we've shared facts with you and some ideas with you. The question is, what are we going to do with them? So I'm very keen to get your questions to Clem and Davi. I've got some questions, but I'd much rather start with yours. But the point about it is, what I've learned is that sharing data doesn't change much. The way learning happens in my life, I don't know about yours, is first I have to experience something. And when I experience it, then I change my emotions. And once I've changed my emotions, I'll change my mind. So if I'm living in a fearful, isolated, gated community called Dainfern, worrying about Diepsloot over the wall, and I have no emotional connection with it, the chances of me embracing the opportunities approximate zero. Is that fair? Do you agree? So what I want you to reflect on as we go through the Q&A is, how will you change your habits of learning? So take the meal today. Pork at 10. I love it. And, it's like, what? I used to think the Far East was Benoni. And then I started traveling 25 years ago, happily supported by people my height, which was very encouraging. But I have learned more from the East than I have from the West in the last 20 years. There's a great scholar who's written a book called The New Silk Road, Frankopan, Peter Frankopan, a Cambridge professor of history. He tested an audience of 500 elite Brits the other day. It was wonderful. It's a YouTube video, The Death of Democracy. It's a great debate. And he said, how many of you can name a famous Chinese author? How many American authors can you name? How many of you can name a Middle Eastern scholar? And of course, the problem is the history shape. Someone once said to me, the future is history waiting to happen. The future is history waiting to happen unless something else happens. And that something else is the magic of the time we're in, the leadership. So let me open it up to comments to them. I've got some questions, but I'd much rather you start the dialogue than me. So please just raise your hand and pose your question or share your comment. Try and keep it short. Question or comment. I'm going to take 3. One over there. Can I see another hand? Just hold your thoughts for a second. Another hand. I'm not starting until I got 3. There's 2 and there's 3. So I'll go 1, 2 because he's right next to him, and then Sandra. Go
to
ahead.
Mr. Santa, just in 4 years' time or after the next election, who do you think will succeed Cyril Ramaphosa? So I'm more concerned with what is going to happen after the election, after the 4 years that we're going to have, hopefully with Mr. Ramaphosa.
Beautiful. Have you got aspirations in that regard?
Not at this stage.
Not
no.
at this stage. Okay. Lovely. Number 2. Why not? Sorry. Why don't you have aspirations in that regard?
Because I'm a whitey.
So you see everything in terms of race. Right, next to you.
Actually, he's a budding winemaker. So my question is more with the relationship of South Africa and Zimbabwe. So we've seen the exit of Robert Mugabe, Ngangwa that's in terms of he's talking a very promising future. And then when I look back in South Africa, so you go to restaurants, Uber drivers, all these guys are from Zimbabwe. And my question is, what's the chances, let's say that they achieve what they're setting out to be, and we see this exodus of all these Zimbabweans in South Africa, because they've got land and houses and family back home. When I engage with them, I say, if things are perfect or things are improved drastically, would you stay or go? They say, without a doubt, they'll go back. And if that does happen, what's the vacuum that we're left with in South Africa from consumers, products we consume?
Got it. Lovely. Can I just ask you this? Why are you asking that question?
So I think Well, I don't know. It's just something that I've been thinking about.
It was the bowl of noodles that did something to you?
No, I think it's...
What's behind it? I'm very interested.
So for me, it's a case of, if there's this vacuum,
Yeah.
So it's a case of, like Clem spoke about, the flag that comes up, is it risk or opportunity?
Okay, lovely. Thank you. And Sandra.
Thank you, Nick. It's a question that mixes two of the discussion points. You mentioned, Clem, that the biggest flag for you was creating opportunity for young people. And you mentioned, Davi, about blockchain. I'm just wondering if that technology and that whole blockchain movement could feed into Clem's concept of creating massive opportunities for young people and new businesses.
Lovely, thank you. Right, so let's tackle those three. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start on the successor to Ramaphosa. Look, obviously, in normal terms, the deputy president becomes the president, and therefore David Mabuza would be considered the natural successor to Cyril. But there is, as a scenario planner, a wildcard scenario that the ANC don't get 50% in the next general election. The EFF merges with the ANC, and the next president after Cyril is Julius Malema. I'm serious. You know, he's a very clever guy. I mean, I can tell you, I watched his speech at Oxford, and it was probably the best speech I've seen any politician make in the UK about, you know, South Africa. And secondly, when I debated him, he has an incredibly clever mind, a good grasp of rhetoric, and I personally think that he can be changed on some of these key issues because he's a very clever guy. So I don't regard it as an altogether, you know, catastrophic scenario. But yeah, that's what I would say.
And so the question, if I can just follow that up on your behalf about the EFF, I never know if it's left or right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In other words, it's
look, obviously the nationalization of the banks and is left. And obviously turning the land, the government owning the land so that we all basically own our property leasehold would be considered a left-wing initiative. But there were so many things I heard in the talk where he agreed with me on small business and on employee share ownership schemes in order to widen the ownership of wealth in South Africa. So that's why I certainly came up with a more positive attitude towards his philosophy than when I went in.
Do you think it will comply with the rule of law in a sense? You know, it's changed shape, the EFF, hugely in the last years. When I watch its rallies, I'm amazed at its discipline and organizational skills. But do you think it will abide with the Constitution and the rule of law? Some people are suggesting that expropriation without compensation is a way of opening a door to significant constitutional reform.
Yeah, look, the one rule of the game of South Africa has been that we have been an extraordinarily diverse society with lots of checks and balances in the system. I, for example, feel that the relationship between the army and the president is completely different to most other African countries where you have a very close connection between the two. We don't. The army is run completely separately. So the idea that you can get the singularity of power that you need to usurp the Constitution and just do your own thing, I think that is as hard to imagine in South Africa as you would imagine Trump becoming genuine commander-in-chief of America.
Trump was unimaginable until he landed. Davi, do you want to comment on the Cyril Ramaphosa question?
I think the first, that's it. I think before we speculate on the politics in South Africa, I think what we have to understand that there's a lot of uncertainty as things stand at the moment. And that uncertainty has to do with the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa is not a very strong president yet, simply because he hasn't had time to consolidate his power yet. Of course, hopefully that will change. And of course, a president shouldn't be too powerful, but he shouldn't also not be too weak. And I think he's probably too weak at the moment. And one can see it in many sort of things. I don't think David Mabuza would have been a deputy president if he was a strong president, for instance. So we're probably going to wait until the next election, which I think the ANC is going to win quite comfortably. And the reason for that is because the DA is in self-destruct mode pretty much. And then, of course, obviously, eventually it's supposed to be David Mabuza to be our next president, but I'm not so sure about that. I think there's going to be a lot of infighting in the ANC, especially as Cyril becomes more powerful, and I will be surprised if it is David Mabuza. On the EFF, yes, I understand the narrative that the EFF, or actually the ANC is EFF light, not the other way around, and that eventually that he could come back. But I'm afraid if the EFF policies really are implemented in South Africa will be like Chavistas. They're pretty much Chavistas, and it will follow the same route as Venezuela. That is a destructive kind of macroeconomic policies approach. But I think the first thing is that there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the political power where it vests at the moment, and we probably have to wait until the next election.
Lovely, thank you. Let's start with you on Zim and the point about skills.
If I can turn the Zim question around, instead of answering that one, let me just turn it a little bit around. And I speak to all sort of audiences, and one of the questions that's always one of those questions is that people are going to ask us about the porous borders, and everybody is coming from all over Africa, flocking into South Africa, and all the problems that come with that. And we see that rich people complain about that, and poor people complain about it. Poor people see them as a competition. Rich people see them as a security sort of threat. And I think that, and we haven't spoken about Africa, and I think that is an opportunity actually that we're missing out on. And you're absolutely right. If the Zimbabweans, for whatever reason, suddenly leave South Africa, there's going to be a huge vacuum in South Africa, and we're probably going to lose a lot of very good people, wealth creators in South Africa. And I think what we need to do in Africa, and the president recently on the summit even mentioned a currency for Africa. I don't think it's going to get to that. But the important thing is what I need to do. Africa is approximately 2% of the world's economy. It's a tiny country. Africa is a tiny country with more than 1 billion people. We have to remove the obstacles within Africa to allow Africa to do more business with itself and with the rest of the world. And there are 3 obstacles that I see. The first one is infrastructural obstacles. It's difficult to move stuff from A to B. The second is a deficit in terms of human capital. People are not properly skilled in Africa. We need to do something about that. But the most important obstacle in Africa is a lack of proper institutions. Let me give you a simple example. Go and buy a property in Velancouzas, for example, and try to enforce that contract. It's huge. It's very, very difficult. And I think that those are the 3 things that we need to understand. And then, in practical terms, open Africa up, allow people to move around, allow capital to move around. But very importantly, and I'm pretty much ideologically biased in what I believe in, and that is we have to protect private property rights. That's important. But open Africa, and we can even have an African currency, although I don't think that's going to happen.
Lovely. I want to be provocative before we come to Sandra's question. Is for elites protecting private rights the excuse to do very little?
No, without a doubt, that's not the case. It's only for the
why
elites.
you believe that.
It is for everybody, because we all want to become successful, and actually, we don't necessarily want to become necessarily stinking rich. We all want to achieve that status, what I call middle class. Middle class is not about income. Middle class is much more than income. Middle class is a stable family life. It's a safe family life. It's good health services. It's good schools. It's to feel that is what middle class is. And you need to hook that on a couple of things. And one of those things that you need to hook it onto is to know this is my house.
You're describing what we would like. I want to challenge what is. And we know inequality has grown enormously. 80% of South Africa's food is produced by 200 farmers.
Yeah.
So the elites, political, cultural and economic elites have become, and this was the point that you raised, Clem, overwhelmingly powerful. So the middle class, I want to challenge that concept to say, what is the role of elites in this kind of environment? And I'm asking you, the privilege we enjoy, is that protection of property rights a way of not creating an inclusive sharing economy?
You're mixing two things here. The one is you're mixing capital with income. And we have to understand there's a bit of a difference between the two. Let me just get to income. Everybody's talking about income inequality. And the easiest way to reduce income inequality in South Africa is to fire half the civil service. because that's where the income inequality comes from. But more important, we've got income inequality today because the real inequalities between people with jobs and people without jobs. That is a real income inequality. But you're right, and then I'm talking now, it sounds like Piketty, but you're right, certainly there are a couple of rich people, and there are people without access to capital. But the biggest and the strongest and the best kind of capital is know-how in a modern economy how to do stuff. So it's not about physical capital, because the physical capital means nothing if you don't have the know-how and the skills to do something with that physical capital. But you're right, there should be a redistribution of capital, and it is happening. In fact, the South African fiscus is the most redistributive fiscus in the world.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Clem.
Yeah, I've got a new term, Chanel rich. It's not when you're stinking rich. It's when you're sweet-smelling rich. Yeah, I just want to comment on Zim. Would you believe it? Earlier this century, Chantal and I were asked to do a 2-day workshop for ZANU-PF. So we had this amazing feeling that here were 2 white South Africans being asked to facilitate the session. We did it actually at the Saxon Hotel, just up the road. And they flew down ministers and other people to this session. And we wrote 3 scenarios for Zim. Grounded, which was the scenario they were in. Takeoff and all the flags that gave them takeoff. And then the long-term scenario, flying high. And it actually was a fantastic session. Uncle Bob wasn't there. And we thought, gosh, this is really going to open up the conversation on how to reconstruct the Zimbabwean economy. And apparently, when they got back with all the kind of ideas that they had, Bob just went, "Krumpf." And it was never talked about, anything like that. Thank heavens he's gone, and we got this new guy. So I do think there's real hope. And the one thing that comes out from my occasional visit to Zim, and also Chantal, who goes up there quite often, is that in a funny way, Zim has a better education system than we do for the masses, because the teachers are accountable in Zim. And so, yeah, I think this is an incredible opportunity to form a closer relationship.
I'm going to come to more questions. Can I just ask, how many of you been to Lagos? I'm not going to ask London. So I'm keen to build the map and to say that Zim is an extraordinary case study of state failure, your final category. And when you look at the data about Zim, it should never have happened. Should not have happened. And I think part of it has to do, and I'm going to come back, I don't mean to provoke you anymore, but to say white Zimbabweans failed to arrive in Zimbabwe. Throughout the 80s, they lived in Rhodesia. And that's folly. Folly
well,
is...
I can vouch for that, because I did the last speech at the Commercial Farmers Banquet before the invasions. And in fact, they had absolutely no idea what was going to happen in 2 months' time. The invasions happened 2 months after the banquet. So
the question is, when do you miscalculate your real interests? And Barbara Tushman, the wonderful historian, said, folly is when you miscalculate your own interests knowing better. And I look at South Africa and say, we've got all the data. You go to exclusive books here and look at the non-fiction South African book list. There must be 150 books in there, new books written in the last 10 years. So we have all the information. And I'm very optimistic. I love your reorganizing the scenarios into 60% getting it right. But it's a window. It's really what I want to stress. Let's come to Sandra's question about blockchain. I know you're very clear about
I'm stoneage.com, so...
But I'm interested in your observation about it, Clem. Do you,
no.
Do you agree with what Darby's saying?
Absolutely. No, that's why I say it. And he explained it in a beautiful... I can go back home this evening and tell my wife about blockchains, because I love the example of the mobile phone. It absolutely gets that. The only question I have for Darby is, how do you know how extended the network is when you buy into a blockchain to ensure that there's a certain level of security? That would be the only question. But
sure.
Obviously, having heard about this and knowing that one of the charms of Bitcoin is that you cannot change data yourself. And therefore, it is a publicly owned sort of ledger.
Yeah,
except the only thing is you can't wear a Bitcoin like gold. can wear gold. But
Only Lebanese wear gold around their necks. So go ahead.
Okay, and then maybe I'll can see. I've been thinking about your question, but maybe I can just add to the explanation of the blockchain, or just to explain where the word blockchain comes from. Remember the example that I used of information about ownership that moves from an individual to the other individual, the ownership of the cell phone that I use as an example. Somebody needs to verify a couple of things. Somebody needs, one of these computers on this network needs to verify that I'm indeed the owner, that I'm allowed to transfer ownership, that the next guy is actually part of this network. That's how the thing keeps himself intact. That's how you know the size of the. So the next guy is in fact part of the network, that he's allowed to accept ownership. Sort of that, whether this transaction can actually happen. Now a lot of computers, this is all written in mathematical formulas. And all these computers on a network compete to see who can first get to the answer of this mathematical formulas. Now that process is called mining. And then once somebody confirms what I've just said, then that computer says, listen, this transaction can happen. I've succeeded in verifying that this transaction can happen. And that piece of information, ownership moving from me to that next person, it's called a block. And now we just simply hook this block on a previous information, making it the blockchain. That's where it works. That's what the mining process is. But coming to your question, your question is essentially, how can a blockchain be used to create opportunities, especially for smaller businesses and so on? And we need to turn that question around, because I don't believe in creating opportunities for people. I don't believe, people make use of the opportunity, things that are around. They make use of their environment, whatever environment it is, to do stuff. And the biggest obstacle is not that we do not have opportunities. The obstacle is that people are prevented from making use of the opportunities that there are. And there are so many examples. Now, I'm in financial services industry. We've got a company, and there are many laws and things, and every day there's a new law, new regulation. It is a nightmare. And whenever there's a new law and a regulation on the financial industry, I say, hallelujah. I like that. Because it makes other people, make it more difficult for them to become insiders where I am already. So do not create opportunities. Just remove the obstacles. And you will be amazed of the power and the energy and the business sense that's out there in the private sector and the stuff that they can do.
Just to follow up on Sandra's question, though, do you think that it lends itself to smaller businesses?
Yeah, it is. In fact, and I'm a bit of an anarchist in a philosophical sense of the word. And this is really the opportunity for everybody really to take control of your own destiny. I'm a little bit skeptical about small businesses. I know Clem has been talking about small businesses, and the reason I'm a little bit skeptical about small businesses is because small businesses do not contribute much. Well, now I have to be very careful, but small businesses they are usually sort of small businesses. Their contribution and value add is relatively small. But if you put a lot of people, a lot of energy together, and you create a big business, wow, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of wealth creation, there's a lot of scale economics, there's a lot of tax that's being paid and all that stuff. But yes, the answer is yes. It's going to put more power in the hand of the individual, making it possible for the individual to hook onto other individuals in sort of new business structures. Yes.
Do you have faith in the next generation? So, Uber was a small business that became a very big business, right? Using this kind of new technology. Do you have faith in the next generation? Why? So maybe we'll come back to that. I'd like to hear some
Well, can I
comments.
just make one point apropos this question? Is what's changed Africa is the smartphone. So it is quite, it's an absolutely appropriate, it's transformed doing business in Africa.
Fabulous. Right, let's get three more. There's one there. There were lots of questions just now. The lady over there. And you want a second crack, which is fine. So 1, 2, 3.
Morning.
It's Nikki. Sorry, I couldn't see you.
I think my question is more of an observation rather than a question, and I'd like your thoughts on it. With regards to living in South Africa, I've always said when you employ young people, it's a bit like living in a casino. You never know their future because you always look like you're playing black or red. And my concern coming out of today in Clem's grey flags is what is happening with the future of our children? What is happening with the generation? And I'm not talking about the privileged few, I'm talking about the masses. So for me, if we look at education at the moment, it's not an attractive sector that's pulling in new teachers, pulling people in to educate. We've dropped the maths and science scores, and we've got a democracy or a generation that's come out of democracy, and there's really no vision for them. That's the first point, so I'd like to hear your comments on that. Secondly, these children need to live in a country where there's lawlessness. There is no moral compass at the moment for them to stay, for them to invest, and for them to create some kind of debt. And we all know that debt creates a middle class. So if the banks, I remember 20 years ago, you could get a 100% bond. You can't get it anymore. So what is happening in the fiscal structure, or what is happening, what are your views on what's happening with children and how we can make sure that A, they stay, and B, that they are the future investors in this country?
Lovely. Thanks, Nikki. So I'm going to take an answer to that question from both of you, and then I'm going to come to you over there. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are absolutely right. We always said when we profiled a winning nation in the mid-'80s in the High Road presentation, education, 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 number one. And yeah, as I said, it's a sad fact that the masses do not have a quality of education here because you know, we don't have that accountability in our schools, which exists in a place like Zimbabwe. But I have to offer one ray of hope, which is, as chairman of the Anglo Social Responsibility Fund, we often found principals who were real champions of their school. That was the critical variable. And as soon as we gave money to that school, their results improved. So we should probably have a principals academy. But there's lots of modern technologies that can improve education. We can do it fairly quickly, but you're absolutely right to place it at the top of the list. I do have to say that there are a lot of black students who are incredibly good, clever, can become good entrepreneurs, like Sia, and so forth and so on. And taking Dawi's point, if they can create a business which turns into an apple, that will do a hell of a lot for South Africa. So we can't be too desperate. There are a lot of bright, black, white, Indian-colored students around who can do things, but it is the number one objective. And I personally think the DA has to go for something positive now, rather than just be negative about everybody else and have the rows that they're having in Cape Town with Patricia de Lille. And their slogan should be economic liberation with education. And they should go for it and say, this is what we would do to the education system if we were elected.
Thanks for that, Clem. And on morality, any thought? On morality?
Morality? Yeah. I mean, one of the flags that I talk about is corporate governance and the fact that it has become a huge issue. And yeah, the penalty for not maintaining your ethics is much higher than it was. Now, as far as young people are concerned, I slightly differ. Yes, there are gangs, and yes, there are nasty people, and we've got lots of nasty incidents, and you know, on any crime statistic, it's pretty nasty. But the one lovely thing about living in South Africa is there are so many naturally nice people around who I meet when I do talks in the township and so forth and so on. I don't feel any physical insecurity. Yeah. So I don't think that you know, we've got a huge challenge ahead of us, but we have to obviously throw ethics into the equation when teaching.
Lovely. Thanks, Clem.
Kids.
Davi.
Yeah, on education, I just want to make two points. First of all, is that about a year is qualifications. Now, I disagree with that. Because what we need is not more qualifications. We've got this fixation on qualifications. Yeah. We better change that to skills development.
Absolutely.
You get qualification called matric, that's not worth anything. That's the first point. Secondly, is that we've got a business plan in education that's 1,000 years old. We better change that. In future, you're not going to get, like what we have currently, get qualified for something, then you become that. In future, you will keep on learning forever. And you're going to work until you're 80 or 90 years old. So it's important, not qualifications, but skills and continuous learning. And then on morality, if I can just make a comment, and the big thing, whenever you talk about business, I'm in business as well, and I get it all the time, business people are uncompetitive, they're immoral, and this and that, and this and so. The nature of business, and I'm just using it as one example, and that's how people must understand morality in business. The nature of business is to be uncompetitive. That is the idea. I do not want competition. The reason why I employ the best people out there is because I want to be better than the next guy. The reason why I put out advertisement there is because I want to tell everybody I'm better. I do not want this guy to compete with me. It's exactly the opposite. You must have a hole in your head if you want to go and compete. You do whatever you can to get rid of your opposition. It doesn't mean you go and shoot the guy. That's not what I'm saying. There's a certain playing field. But some people are going to win. That's it. Accept that. And that's the nature of business, to try to get rid of your competition. And the best guy should win. That is the nature of business.
Is that what's called a blockchain?
I have to say,
yeah, go ahead.
I have to say one thing. The biggest flag in ethics to go up in the US with the work we do there is Harvey Weinstein. I mean, that just shows one domino, woof, the whole chain falls, and it has absolutely changed what is acceptable behavior.
Steinhoff. All right, so interesting discussion about the nature of competition. I remember Walt Whitman said competition only exists when people are too stupid to prevent it. So that's your thesis. It's not a thesis shared by everybody. Okay, good. This lady over there.
Hi, so I don't have a question, but I have just more of a comment. I'm from a fairly young generation. I'm a millennial, actually. And I think our group of, our generation looks at the world a bit differently than what I've heard it being discussed here. So we do recognize that there are a lot of problems in the world, but at the same time, I feel like our generation looks at these challenges and these problems more as areas of opportunity rather than just dismay and hopelessness. And another thing, just on a different note as well, just the challenge that I have for people that are here who would like to actually make an impact. It all takes, I like that you were saying that, a lot of people are sitting there in Dainfern worried about the little neighborhood, in Diepsloot. And that kind of thinking creates a lot of space, and it contributes, and it really perpetuates this whole inequality that exists between us, and it creates fear. I think the best thing to do in terms of eliminating inequality starts just by exposing yourself to the other side of the world, and then getting to understand what is actually happening and getting closer to what you are in fact fearing or don't know about. Getting to understand that better, then we can come up with solutions that are actually effective and inclusive, and we can work together as a better nation, I think, in that manner.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to come back to this youth question in a minute, but I just want to ask Clem a question, and Davy, feel free to comment if you like. I mean, South Africa's history for the last 300 years has been the imposition of a European system, and that's changing. So if you look ahead 20 years, how would you describe South Africa culturally?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one because I do think that over my lifetime in South Africa, we are changing our culture. So yeah, it'll be very different in 50 years' time. As a scenario planner, I haven't done scenarios on that. But I'd like to just say one thing to that question, which is the first thing when we have a conversation with these students at these schools is we say, trace your destiny line from your birth to where you are today. What are the flags you took advantage of? What were the flags you missed? And then describe what you feel you are today, because you've got to get that right before you start looking at the future. So you're quite right about doing that kind of introspective study to try and get rid of your fears before you look at the future.
So I'm going to ask the audience as media experts to pick up on this thought, because my sense is different about the intergenerational change. And if I look at what's happening politically and culturally, maybe not in Hyde Park, but in the broader country, I'm seeing a new generation. And I'm very excited about that new generation. I'm wondering how you interpret that. David, do you want to comment?
Yeah, what's the future going to look like, Clem? And I also do not know. But I've got given the new technology and so on, I've got a suspicion that the future is going to be more of the city-state kind of concepts that we had 100 and 200 years ago. Small, and not necessarily geographically or like a city. It could be some digital kind of groupings. So I think there will be more groupings in future. There's this, because technology will allow us. But I like your comment about seeing opportunities. And there are two things that I think that we have to understand. You know, there are a couple of fears out there, and people want to evade. One fear is the fear of being unemployed, or the fear to be poor, for instance. And therefore, typically what politicians will do, they will prevent companies, or try to prevent companies from going bankrupt. They will try to create jobs, for example. And that is so wrong. But this idea of job creation is a stupid idea. Who came up with this idea of job creation? Never ever in the history of mankind have we ever tried to create jobs. We have always been destroying jobs. The reason why I came with my car today and not by horse is because it's more comfortable. But if I came by horse, we would have had a huge industry looking after horses only. And that's what we have. Until Ford got rid of the horse industry. Destroy jobs. That's the thing. And don't be scared to destroy jobs. Politicians confuse keeping people busy with jobs. The second thing that's important, whenever a business goes under, we say, oh my goodness, poverty, bad. It's a good thing. It's a good thing if a business goes under, because it means that capital couldn't be used well by those entrepreneurs in charge of that capital. So you liquidate this business. You take the capital and give somebody else a chance. And maybe that person is more successful. So that's the nature of success. Continuous destruction and recreation of new businesses. And allow that to happen. And that's how you create new jobs. And don't be fearful of losing your job. And don't be fearful of trying a new business, because you must make use of your opportunities. And you're absolutely right on that.
So as media people, I'm assuming, we haven't commented much about culture, I'm assuming you are anthropologists and sociologists. Because in my sense, culture comes before anything. Culture is identity. And identity is how we relate and how we belong and who we affiliate with in groups. And so to my mind, I'd love to hear anyone to pick up the intergenerational story and the broader story of what is the character of South Africa. I'll just give you the demographics. Demographics fascinate me. I think history is all about demographics. When we look at the rest of Africa and we know we're going to double our population to 2 billion people within your grandchildren's lifetime, and that 50 or 60% of the world's under 15-year-olds will be in Africa, I mean, demography is the future. So let me give you the demography of South Africa. In 1910, of the total population of South Africa, 22% was white. 22% in 1910. Today, anybody? 1%? No. 10%? No. Somewhere between 1 and 10, 7 or 8. So if you look 50 years ahead, you know, the average Nigerian family size is 6.5 children. You do the arithmetic. That's fantastic. So demography is a big descriptor of where things are going. Attached to demography is culture. So I see South Africa as a hybrid society, blessed with so many different cultures. What kind of leaders and what kind of ideas will be the narrative that will excite a younger generation about identity? And that's the world in which most of you work, I think. Let me come to your second question.
Oh. So just a question from our side. It's something that I've picked up over the last, I'd say, 4 months. Just having general conversations with random strangers, engaging with clients. But there's always somebody that's immigrating. And there seems to be more of that conversation happening now than in the last 10 years. And the question I have is, how big is that immigration or that exodus, and it obviously, I put it to stemming from the Zuma the Zuma years. So it's a case of how big is that immigration that we're seeing, and where and how does it play itself out in the next 5 years.
Can I ask you how old you are?
40.
Confess.
40.
30. You started to say 30. 40. Okay.
No,
So,
40.
so the three of us were around when the last great white tremor of immigration happened.
In the 90s.
In the 80s and 90s. And let me just give you my quick response to you. I say to that community then, as I would now, because there has been a bit of an uptick. You know, look, let's not kid each other. A year ago, South Africa felt like it was heading to the DRC. We will become a failed state. We've maybe turned the corner. But I always used to say to people then, two things. One is that immigration is an increasingly global phenomenon. So a lot of Australians work in Britain, not because they're banning Australia. But I used to always make a joke about it. I used to say, for white South Africans, you've got three options. You can stay and build a new country. You can hide, but don't stay and emigrate. Sorry, you can stay and build a new country, you can emigrate, but don't stay and emigrate. In other words, don't get so paralyzed by your fear about the other, whatever other is, that you stay and emigrate. And I feel the fear. You know, there is fear in this country, and there is frustration. What leaders do, Mao said it best. He said, when hurricanes come, build windmills. In other words, the fear, turn the fear, as you were saying, turn the fears and frustrations into opportunities. And what I would say from my generation to someone a little younger than me is, look what has happened. I have a friend who immigrated to Sydney, and he kept phoning me, saying, you must come, you must come. And then 20 years later, he came back to Joburg, and he said to me, I said to him, you've probably made more money than me, you've been safer than me, but I've lived a better life. And he acknowledged that. Because Australia, you know, if a cabbage bites a dog, it's headline news in Australia. This is a place, if you get home safely, you go, made it home again. So there's life to be lived here. And I think those of us who've been through this in our generation, as we go around the world, we interest people because we've lived a richer life because of where we are. So the immigration thing's a natural thing in my view. I'm keen to hear what the other two say. For business, it's natural to be global. For people, I would say to every South African under the age of 30, get out of here for a year or two. You know, if you only live in one village, you have no idea about the neighbors. And as I've traveled the world, I learn from everyone, copy no one. Learn from everyone, copy no one. But economy class seats are cheap. And if you haven't been to Istanbul and you haven't been to Jakarta, how on earth do you understand country? If you haven't been to Mexico, how would you understand this place? The reflex in Hyde Park will be it's a bit like England. And that would be a terrible misunderstanding. So I'm not that fearful. I think it's a tremor that's going through the system. And I think if we turn this CR era into something practical, people won't, some will leave, it's natural. But others will come. I thought your original question about Zim was going to be, if South Africa is growing at 5 to 8%, will the immigrants come back? That's what I thought you were asking about Zim. Because if I was Zimbabwean and my home and family and my homestead is Zim, I would want to go back to Zim because I'm Zimbabwean. I think maybe, like Poland, if you look at what happened in Poland in the 90s, the Poles who left communist Poland went back and built an economy. So that's what I thought you were asking. Anyway, comments on immigration.
Well, my point is you're quite right. It is raised as an issue, particularly by these young pupils that we're teaching here, you know, because we get them to concentrate on looking at, you know, scenarios for the future of South Africa, of particular industries that they're interested in joining. And then, of course, one of the principal questions is, do you think that I can get a better life in other countries in the rest of the world? And I always say it really depends, because there are so many South Africans who've emigrated to other countries who actually, in retrospect, haven't done that well. And because I've lectured South African audiences in London, in Australia, in Canada, and yeah, it's actually very tough out there. Obviously, you can get a lucky break like Elon Musk, but it doesn't come that often. All I can say personally is I'm an immigrant here because I was brought up in the UK and only emigrated out of the UK when I was 27. And yeah, I'm absolutely pleased that I've lived my life here, and all my relations who speak in a very snobbish way and say, when are you coming home? Home. And I say, South Africa is my home, so I'm not coming home.
Okay.
The lovely thing is we can watch the wedding and not feel British, so it's fine.
Indeed, after the fall of communism, the Poles went to Spain, amongst others, because of this huge building boom that they had in Spain. And then the financial crisis came and the whole building thing collapsed in Spain, and they all immigrated to England, resulting in Brexit in the end. but you know, of course we see that. That's part of the modern economy, is that people move around. That's right. In fact, I will encourage people to do that. But I think there's an undertone to your question as well, and your undertone is loyalty. You should be loyal to South Africa, or you should be loyal to something.
No, I'm saying, so if we see all these people leaving, so firstly when you, having engaged with these people, one of the key things for immigration is you need to have some sort of degree, so qualifications and skills and knowledge that's needed. So if that's leaving, we spoke earlier about a sort of a struggling education, Department of Education. So these gaps and voids that are left, what are we going to get? What fills this?
Yeah.
And where does that put what trajectory does that put
Sure.
our economy and our country?
Sure. We're losing a lot of people, very skilled people, without a doubt. But what also is happening, and I've seen this myself, is that you get to these, there's waves going out and there's waves coming back again. And I would actually encourage that very much. But may I make a comment about loyalty? Because this is, you never say something about, you have to be loyal to your country and you have to, all this. Your loyalty, the first person, the most important person for you in your life must be yourself. And I don't say that in a bad way. Because in a plane, sorry about the planes, if you get into trouble and so on, first make sure you've got the oxygen stuff sorted out for yourself before you can help other people. And that must be your priority. Is that you must look after yourself. You are the most important person, and then the people close to you. And very importantly, is make sure that you're successful in whatever you do, your career, and it doesn't matter where you do that, locally or internationally, in your business, because that is what really matters. And I always encourage people, never ever break any laws, but pay as little tax as legally possible.
Lovely, Davy. So in your ideal world, the world is full with individuals focusing on themselves, so long as the building's not on fire. And if the building's on fire, we've got to put out the fire. And I think South Africa, there are fires in the periphery of this country, and we better put them out. It's in our interest to do that.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Let me add.
Yep.
And that is, you've got two choices. You've got a country that is hugely regulated, and you know exactly what you need to do.
Yep.
You don't need to think because there are rules. Or you have a country where that's much less regulated, and a country where you have to think and we have to apply your own conviction before you make decisions. I prefer the latter.
Lovely, beautiful. Hold that. Let me ask Clem. What's your philosophy on this?
On
this question, Davi's very articulately laid out a philosophy. He says, look after yourself. The fox first has to eat. Then it can have babies.
Absolutely. Well, Davi's example was the mask. The planes go, yes, the oxygen mask.
What's your philosophy?
No, I have a slightly different philosophy because having been part of Anglo for so many years, Ernest Oppenheimer said to us, you must make money, but you must make money in a way that makes a permanent contribution to the community. So he was quite foxy. He didn't say just go out there and make money. He basically said that if we're going to last 100 years, you've got to be a company that actually is seen to make a contribution to the community at large. So I do think it's a balance. I do think it's a balance. But I do think that people mustn't go into that third mode of hiding in South Africa. This is a very, very critical moment. This is as critical as 1989. 1990, because we are at the economic crossroads, and it's going to require, for me, a lot of collective effort to go into the next phase with confidence and stay in the Premier League. I want to just mention one thing, because we haven't raised it, and if there are a lot of media people here, there is a huge flag in the media industry, and that is the internet. I've discussed it with several media groups, and the fact is that you can now get news free on the internet. It's created a huge challenge around the world with some newspapers saying you can have our newspaper for 1 month for $1. You have The Guardian UK saying, please give money for our overworked journalists. And so really, media groups now have to decide what is the best model for, the new game which has been caused by the internet.
It's lovely because Davy would say, I think, that in the Darwinian world, that's a fantastic thing. Because we've democratized the media.
Come on, no.
I'm pushing him.
I have 2 rules, and these are the rules that I live by. First of all, I do not steal. Steal means I can't take somebody else's stuff, but I can also not prevent other people to do their thing.
Got it?
Like I also cannot take their lives. It's called murder. And if they want to go and associate, whatever, I do not steal. The second rule that I live with, I honor my contracts. If I tell you I'm going to do something, I try my real and my best to do that. And that is so difficult to live by those 2 rules. And if we all live by those 2 rules, those flames will all be gone.
Beautiful. Lovely place on which to end. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together. And thank you all for coming. I hope you found 1 or 2 thoughts that you're going to action out of the discussion. And most of all, I hope we've elevated your curiosity. One of the things about South Africa that intrigues me is whether we're just too conservative. We're a very conservative country, in fact. And what lies behind conservatism is the absence of curiosity. Otherness is the core of this new century. Them is the core of how we learn. And not, the non-South African story is the core of how South Africa can achieve its potential. I worry a great deal of how we would get to 5%. I can't see what our competitive edge is. We're a services economy today. We once were a mining economy. We're not a mining economy anymore. 65% of our GDP is services. That's a knowledge-intense economy. That's why the emphasis on education. But that's why the emphasis is on all of our own learning. You put it beautifully. Today, a university is not what it was where you prepared your future leaders. That's nonsense. It's a lifelong journey of learning in institutions and not in institutions. So I encourage you all to think about your habits of learning. To think, if you look at chess masters, how much time do they train? If you think about golfers or football players, how much time do they train? We're in a profession that where training really matters. So how do you organize your learning in whatever way it is? Thank you very much to the organizers. I'm not sure if we should close. We're done. So travel well, and we hope to see you again next year. Thank you.
Thank you.